Thank you and good morning, everyone. May I offer my special thanks to Datuk Sam Manan and his team for inviting me to return to Borneo. My first visit was in July this year, and I was able to see at firsthand the exceptional natural capital with which you are blessed. At the age of 6, I saw this series of programs by David Attenborough. They instilled in me a wonder for nature which grows greater as I grow older. So Borneo has a special place in my heart. Before I lay out my thoughts on 4 key themes, I'd like to share perspectives on the bigger picture against which my comments and our discussions at this conference should be considered, and I'll set that out in terms of both time and space. Placing us in planetary history presents incomprehensible timescales relative to our own lifespans. But if we compress the whole of this planet's evolutionary history into a single day, humans appeared on Earth at 1 second to midnight, and it's almost certain that our species will have disappeared again by 1 second after midnight. In other words, we are insignificant in planetary time, and equally insignificant in planetary space. 2 months ago, it was confirmed that the American space probe Voyager 1 left the solar system, almost 20 billion kilometers away from Earth. It was launched in 1977 when I was 28. On board are greetings from countries around the world, including deeply philosophical offerings such as, "Good night, ladies and gentlemen, goodbye, and see you next time." And from another country, "We are happy here, and you be happy there." I don't think we'll be visited by aliens anytime soon on the basis of those messages. Within a fraction of a second in that compressed timescale, we've witnessed the exponential growth of the human population. This animation shows the great acceleration of human numbers on this planet. And note, when we come to the 19th century, just note the role of the Industrial Revolution. This has shifted from nature and biodiversity shaping human behavior to the reverse, where humans have begun to reshape, even disrupt, nature. Now, on the other hand, the human capacity for invention, for exploration, for collaboration is unrivaled in the animal kingdom. So bearing in mind the long history I just outlined, it took just 66 years from man's first powered flight to Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. Now imagine someone in 1907 suggesting that a man would step on the moon in the lifetime of their children. And it's this potential for extraordinary achievement which keeps me optimistic that we'll eventually align with the natural forces of the biosphere and leave a healthier legacy for future generations. Our theme is unleashing the potential of Borneo's natural capital for sustainable growth, and that's a commendable ambition. And arguably, success or failure could be determined by just the people in this room. And that's not just those with the most formal power, but with each and every one of you. And so as I talk today, I'd ask that you think about a radical ambition for Sabah, indeed for Borneo, in terms of your equivalent of putting a man on the moon. My thoughts this morning are built around 4 key propositions. The first is that we are more dependent on the biosphere than it is on us. If we zoom in to Earth from space, at about 10 kilometers above the surface, we enter the biosphere. It's thin, it's fragile. And if the Earth were the size of a basketball, the biosphere would be the thickness of the cling film we wrap our food in. The biosphere has finite resources. It's governed by fixed laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. It's also very beautiful. Yet, as the author Paul Hawken put it, this planet came with a set of instructions, but we seem to have misplaced them. Important rules like don't poison the water, soil, or air, don't let the earth get overcrowded, and don't touch the thermostat. These rules have all been broken. Some of you will have seen this animation of water vapour systems at the TFA conference in Jakarta earlier this year. It's not only beautiful, but compelling proof that Borneo is at the very heart of the biosphere's life support systems. And should we disrupt the biosphere's natural systems and things go wrong, the biosphere does not, unlike governments, do bailouts. There are planetary boundaries, points at which the carrying capacity of the biosphere is exceeded. Research published in Nature assessed the impact human activity is having in relation to planetary boundaries. It shows we've already breached the capacity limits, particularly in relation to biodiversity loss. We need to reverse that process, and we need an economy that respects and protects natural capital. I've spelled all of this out not because it's new, but because my message this morning is that the market economy has failed us at many levels and is likely to continue to fail us as our grandchildren grow to adulthood. In my view, the urgency of the challenges we face demand a shift from institutional, value-based accounting to individual accountability and values. My second point is that the concept of natural capital is not new, and yet we're still only discussing and exploring rather than actually paying for natural capital. The reality is that we're continuing on a path of business as usual with totally inadequate economic incentives to break through traditional market norms. And the urgency of the challenge is not being met with sufficiently rapid global responses. Protecting natural capital for future generations will, as I've said, require us in the medium term to rely on individual rather than institutional change, and to rely on accountability for rather than accounting for natural capital. If this analysis is correct, it has profound implications for all of us here today and for the Heart of Borneo project. I will elaborate on this later. As I've said, the concept of natural capital is not new. The landmark Brundtland report, Our Common Future, was published in 1987 and introduced the world to the concept and definition of sustainable development. The report makes multiple references to ecological capital and to the need to account for ecosystem and biodiversity impacts of our industrialized society. Take this sentence. Similar incomplete accounting occurs in the exploitation of other natural resources, especially in the case of resources that are not capitalized in enterprise or national accounts, air, water and soil. In all countries, rich or poor, economic development must take full account in its measurements of growth of the improvement or deterioration in the stock of natural resources. Now, at the Heart of Borneo conference 2 years ago, the UNDP's Andrew Bovanek shared this slide with you, and this captures very neatly the current dilemma. I think we all know that business as usual is not a long-term option, and that shifting to SEM, or Sustainable Ecosystem Management, is simply a matter of time. But the $64 billion question for governments and for business is, when will we see the crossover point? And indeed, how will we know that we have? Sadly, I suspect that point is still years and possibly decades away. I do, however, see encouraging signs and signals of change, and I will share some of these now. First, we're well on the road towards valuing natural capital from a philosophical, exploratory and research point of view. NGOs in particular have been pushing this agenda passionately and thoughtfully. Indeed, the many great achievements in furthering the cause of natural capital here in Borneo and elsewhere have almost always seen NGOs like WWF, LEAP, Hutan and PACOS playing crucial roles of facilitation, provocation, connection and collaboration in this field. While NGOs elsewhere are running excellent on-the-ground campaigns and producing provocative and constructive reports and conferences dedicated to this agenda. To point up 3 publications of note. The first is this report, which uses the backing of over $70 trillion of investment funds to elicit from companies their impacts on forests and biodiversity, as well as their strategies for mitigating those risks. Getting a company to measure its impact is always the first step in getting it to manage them. This WWF report targets responsible investors and offers detailed insight into the value chains of key commodities, including palm oil. And thirdly, this book is being published at the UN climate talks next week in Poland. It's an excellent assessment of the drivers and players behind deforestation and includes extensive references to the various economic instruments which individually and together could shift the needle in terms of actively translating the economic theory into practice. The academic world has played an extremely active and positive role too. Their research has enabled us to understand better the impacts and costs of externalities. In terms of the forestry dimension of natural capital, researchers fieldwork around the world, but most notably here in Borneo, through these and other programs under the auspices of the Royal Society, has given us hard evidence of the systemic effects of deforestation and how to optimize the system's benefit of alternative approaches to avoided deforestation, to reforestation, and to afforestation. These are all critical inputs to measuring and managing our natural capital responsibly. However, the publication of this academic paper in 1997 has arguably done most to directly link natural capital and economics. For the first time, it put a financial number against the value of ecosystems and laid the groundwork for the project led by Pavan Sukhdev, who spoke at this conference 2 years ago, resulting in the TEEB report. TEEB standing for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. These two reports combined have had a massive influence on policymakers, businesses, and progressive financial institutions, and they've stimulated wide-ranging research, all of which reposition natural capital by making it of direct relevance to economists and the private sector. Indeed, it stimulated Puma to release a groundbreaking set of accounts which included, at this stage, the notional cost of environmental services and impacts, which are not reflected in traditional accounts. That company's actions alone have spurred a huge number of other companies to begin to measure their relationship with natural capital in this way. It's early days, but the trend is clear and inexorable. A range of studies, primers, and guides have been published over the last few years, presented through different lenses, but all carrying similar messages and conclusions. The assumption that nature's services are unlimited is a fatal flaw of the market economy. The principle of those services being in some way free misses the negative impacts that are not currently calculated into the cost of doing business, and that we need to shift our economic models away from subsidizing industries and practices which undermine natural capital. The challenge, as I've said, is translating that theory into practice, and time is not on our side. And time's not on my side this morning, so whilst I don't have time to take you through the various studies in detail, I do want to highlight a few. And by the way, you'll have a copy of these slides available to you, and the full versions I'm sharing are just 2 or 3 Google clicks away. I'm a founding partner of Volans, which focuses on breakthrough models of capitalism. This report reviews how an issue like natural capital can be addressed through a range of interventions: actual business leadership, markets, finance, and supply chain management, as well as more radical approaches not only to protecting natural capital, but also taking inspiration from nature itself to create new products and markets. Other significant inputs into the private sector include this extremely thoughtful guide, to business by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Businesses which follow its recommendations will progressively build robust strategies for responsible management of natural capital. Now, my earlier remarks were implicitly critical of the UN, but my concern is not for any lack of effort or good intent, but rather its failure in terms of outcomes, in terms of influencing, let alone forcing, the market to value the standing tree more than the logged, or to internalize the true ecosystem costs of current lifestyles and business models. I'm a great believer in the value of global governance and the key role the UN has to play in helping deliver greater security and stability for all the peoples of this world. But the urgency of the challenge demands that we act simultaneously and more quickly from the grassroots up. that we take responsibility to act as individuals within our private and, most importantly, in our professional lives, to use whatever power we have to get the outcomes we need. That we act unilaterally, whether as state governments, as cities, or as corporations, and that we act unilaterally without the bigger policy and economic instruments being in place, and indeed to act unilaterally simply because we can. My third point is that the debate on natural capital misses a key, possibly the key dimension of valuing our biodiversity and ecosystems, the cultural and aesthetic, even the spiritual identification of humans with the natural world. And this is as much to do with human values as it is about economic value. I argue, therefore, that the best hope for positive changes in human behaviour is to shift the focus from value to values. Now, Borneo could use this as a lever to accelerate change. Most analyses of the value of natural capital break it down into these three categories. And don't worry if you can't see the detail, but those categories are supporting, regulating, and provisioning. And they're all essential, yet it's the least explored and the least referenced aspect of natural capital, the cultural dimension, which is potentially the most powerful in shifting society away from business as usual. It's the value, often unquantifiable value, which nature brings to our lives, whether amazing us with its beauty, lifting our hearts, or inspiring our lives. The aesthetic, spiritual, educational, and recreational value of nature is hardly ever part of the debate, let alone part of the current processes for valuing natural capital. The human connection with natural capital is already clear and powerful, and across the planet, as incomes rise beyond the basic needs of food, water, shelter, healthcare, and education, and indeed even before that, quite often, people will donate to protect the natural environment, not only near to home, where they can enjoy the amenity value directly, but also in distant places which they never have and probably never will visit. A small example is this morning's announcement about the transfer of land titles by LEAP. One contributor to this amazing project is a relatively small UK NGO called the World Land Trust. They ran a campaign for just 2 weeks last month and raised $1 million to help fund the purchase of that land to connect what could be called islands of life. What is it that causes distant people not just to want to support such a project, but to go online or make a call and actively donate? Nothing more and nothing less, I feel, than a sense of connection with nature and a wish to preserve the wonders of the natural world. This connection with nature and the human values which underpin that are, I believe, a powerful lever which can be pulled to support Sabah and the Heart of Borneo in finding fair and proper economic return for protecting biodiversity. I'd like to come back now to the ways that we currently value natural capital. At the small, even individual scale, we all understand the premium price commanded by properties with views of the sea, of rivers, of mountains, or of forests. This is natural capital at the aesthetic and cultural level. Its value is clear and is directly quantifiable. At the medium scale, we have examples of payments for ecosystem services, like the Mexican program of payments for hydrological environmental services, which was established in 2003 to address critical depletion of the country's main aquifers by rewarding forest stewards for protecting forest resources in securing national water supplies. On the flight coming over here, I spotted this front page story in the Financial Times about the cost to US farmers of pollination. A comment piece in that same paper noted that dwindling numbers of bees should remind dumb humans how undervalued vital natural systems are within financial models. Hallelujah! The TEEB report attaches value to pollination at 153 billion euros in 2005 on a global basis. In these cases, natural capital has been valued on the basis of capital return, cheaper water security, higher crop yields, for example. The factors and the actors are essentially local geographically, where traditional investment and return criteria have created a functioning market with real prices. At the global scale, however, we find little positive evidence of fair and effective payments for ecosystem and biodiversity services. Our best, and indeed our worst, example of an attempt to value one aspect of natural capital at large, though not yet global scale, is the carbon market. By any measure, this has failed dismally to deliver what free market economists promised, a real internalisation of the price of greenhouse gas emissions, with an economic incentive to shift away from carbon-intensive practices and technologies towards low or no carbon alternatives. The largest scheme to date is the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and the results make sad reading. European emissions of greenhouse gases are down, but so is the price of carbon, from €30 a tonne in 2008 to around €5 today. And the emissions reductions are primarily the result of the economic crisis. My final point concerns the role of the private sector and its value chains. In 2007, I started studying the power of the world's biggest corporations. Like it or not, the past few decades have witnessed a radical shift in power from the public sector to the private, and from national markets to global. In 2007, these were the chief executives of the largest 200 corporations globally. Now, what you'll notice, although that wasn't the purpose of my research, is amongst those 200 CEOs was just one woman. And as an aside, I've increasingly felt that if we had women running our largest corporations, and indeed running our countries, our world and our future would be far more secure. But beyond that provocation, if we analyse further, the power of global corporations is even greater. First of all, the top 200 corporations at that time had total annual sales of about $11 trillion. By 2012, that had increased to $19 trillion. And just to give you of scale, if we look at the gross domestic products of countries and compare that with sales as a relatively good proxy for economic value, in 2012, the top 200 corporations had sales greater than the whole of the GDP of the EU and of the US and indeed of China. Now, estimates by WWF and others suggest that the private sector's role in agri-commodities is concentrated into the value chains of a small number of multinationals, with Global Canopy Programme estimating that 80% of deforestation results from the value chains of just 20 corporations. Whilst for palm oil, it's been estimated that just 9 companies, directly and indirectly, control up to 40% of the value chain. Not surprisingly, there's been increased scrutiny of this power through the value chain in recent years, from the multinationals at the top through the tiers of suppliers right down to the plantation level. In preparing this talk, I discussed this issue with the head of global procurement at Nestlé. I asked to talk to him after a meeting I'd had in July with a village head on the lower Kinabatangan river about this project, a particular one here, called Relief, in which Nestlé have invested money and agronomic skills as part of their creating shared value business model. They invested in the knowledge that the palm plantations on which they depend for a key raw material have damaged or have the potential to damage ecosystems along the river. And restoring the riverine forests not only protects connectivity for many species, but also acts as a buffer between plantations and the river to avoid erosion and runoff from fertilizers, etc. From my conversation with that village head, it was clear that the social and economic benefits to the community involved in growing the seedlings for planting were substantial. Now, overall, my takeout from those two conversations and more is that a new accountability is being imposed on global corporations by their consumers to make their entire value chains more sustainable, and that the private sector is able to respond quickly and efficiently to protect natural capital when it chooses or is forced to. The implications of this are huge. Collaborating with and using regulation incentives to shape corporate value chains is a major opportunity for governments with natural resources upon which those companies depend. The drive for traceability and certification is urgent and powerful, and on-the-ground support to achieve this offers new routes to achieving protection and enhancement of natural capital with the cost built into the value chain rather than being imposed on local states. I would strongly recommend that the governments involved in the Heart of Borneo actively explore the changing landscape of private sector protection of natural capital and engage directly with the 10 to 20 global players in the palm oil industry to identify their needs and to align local incentives and processes to support their need to address this issue. So, in terms of how this all translates into potential forward strategies and roadmaps for Sabah and indeed for the other states of Borneo, I'd offer the following. Overall, make Sabah the world leader in terms of these dimensions. First, research into natural capital through natural and economic sciences, in terms of the scale and effectiveness of forest connectivity, through innovative experiential ecotourism, through the proving of new economic models for natural capital investments, by doubling the sustainable productivity per hectare of palm plantations, and ensuring 100% sustainable certification of palm oil exports. In the time available, I can only offer simple headlines of what might be done in practice, but forward strategies include target values rather than value-driven individuals and organisations for support and investment on your journey towards a green economy. Investing significantly more effort on the cultural, aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of natural capital as a source of economic value. Thirdly, continue to invest in capacity building for REDD+. Build a world-leading strategy for ecosystems and biodiversity research. And finally, prioritise the private sector for engagement, collaboration and systems change. So taking each in turn, target individuals, foundations, companies, states and other institutions who are driven by values rather than traditional forms of value. They are the most likely partners to bring their skills, their influence and even their money in support of Sabah's ambitions during the transition to an adjusted economy which fairly values conservation and restoration of natural capital. Consider creating a team whose sole purpose is to put Sabah on the world map of foundations, NGOs, corporations, and even politicians and parties around the world whose missions are rooted in values which lead them to fight for biodiversity and ecosystem protection and enhancement, and who would look favourably on collaboration, research investment, capacity building and funding positive outcomes. The recent tour of key US institutions by the Forestry Department shows how proactive outreach to friendly parties around the world can lead to potentially transformative relationships. Invest significantly more effort in the cultural, aesthetic and spiritual dimensions. Consider, for example, making Sabah the premium experiential tourist destination for terrestrial and marine wildlife. It is part of Sabah's official plan to build ecotourism, but in doing so to avoid the pitfalls of mass tourism. I endorse the spirit of this and offer two thoughts. The first is to use the urbanisation of the planet to your advantage. Since last year, more than half the world's population lives in urban rather than rural areas. Further, by 2020, there will be 200 more cities in China. This offers a rapidly growing human population who are being denied the joys and wonders of nature. The distance of the next generation from nature in developed economies struck home for me when a UK study showed that children asked where eggs came from were answering the supermarket. My second observation is that growing organisations like Earthwatch now have middle-income Europeans and Americans paying to join wildlife research programmes, paying to get close to nature, and paying for the joy of making a small contribution to the understanding and protection of natural capital. This group is growing and growing very fast and could be a golden opportunity for Borneo. Continue to invest in capacity building. Now, I know from email exchanges with the Deputy Director of Forestry that Sabah has invested significant resource in the REDD+ process, and that the likely economic return in the medium term looks poor. I'd strongly encourage, however, that all involved continue to build institutional capacity and understanding of the rules, processes, procedures and practices of global biodiversity and carbon markets. If you become the go-to experts on all things REDD, I believe you will not only be best placed to benefit from REDD+ and other economic instruments as they build to become very significant sources of future revenue, but also be better placed to influence and shape those instruments to secure fair, efficient and effective outcomes. Build a world-leading strategy for ecosystems and biodiversity research, which builds on the existing world-class work on forests, terrestrial and marine biodiversity. Actively support and promote the leading-edge nature of that research with all stakeholders globally, and consider deepening that research beyond the current bias to mammalian biodiversity. In fact, vertebrates are just 1% of known species. In preparing for this speech, I spoke to a young researcher who's been active in Sabah. In explaining her work on dung beetles, she argued that current priorities for research and for biodiversity protection are insufficiently inclusive of invertebrates in the ecosystem. Consider too extending Borneo's research agenda to bridge the natural sciences work into economics in search of more sophisticated models of valuation and market integration and depreciation. The Maloa Biobank project strikes me as a simply brilliant concept. It's been slower than hoped to take root and to grow as a direct function of the worst possible timing for launch, just when the credit crunch hit. And the very fact that it's innovative works against it, since potential investors are naturally nervous in relation to the risks of trying new models. Having spoken at length to the New Forests team, I'd strongly recommend holding faith with this project. If it takes another 5 years to deliver, it will set a globally leading model for innovative natural capitalism. In addition, Sabah could follow the lead of countries like Germany, Costa Rica and Peru, which are all undertaking assessments of natural capital within their economies as proposed in the TEEB report. And incidentally, I spoke to the lead author of the report, Pavad Sukhdev, a few weeks ago, and should you choose to undertake that assessment, then he's expressed keen enthusiasm to support you on your journey. Now finally, prioritise the private sector for engagement, collaboration and systems change. At its simplest, I'm proposing that you increase the resources invested in private sector engagement, and particularly with those at the top of the supply chain. Companies like Nestlé and Unilever in the food sector have responded to a major Greenpeace campaign in 2010 by committing to 100% sustainable palm oil. It's clear that we're in the early stages of major corporations acknowledging their accountability for the whole of their value chains, right through to the plantation level. The issues of traceability and certification are absolutely centre stage for them now, and indeed for the foreseeable future. I'd recommend targeting the 10 key global corporations in the palm oil value chain to search for collaborative opportunities and to seek their direct support for a 100% certified export policy. The private sector would also be keen, I'm pretty sure, to help in a goal of doubling output per hectare from palm plantations. Nestlé alone have over 1,000 agronomists committed to more efficient and sustainable agriculture. I offer these thoughts and recommendations with due humility. All of you in this room have closer knowledge of many of the issues I've touched upon, and I ask you simply to take from my remarks those points which resonate with you. If I've one hope for today and tomorrow, it's that we all think first through the lens of our personal values, that we think about how we can use our individual power in our personal, but especially in our professional lives, to drive for the outcomes which align with our values. I'd like to close with this quotation from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. So in summary, I'd encourage you in the rest of this conference, and indeed beyond, to be unreasonable, be courageous, and be disruptive. Thank you.